for, oh, there's that strong American voice. Hi, hello. People are joining. I think people have rushed from one place to another or grabbed a sandwich. So I'm going to wait a few moments to let more people join, because I know that if they're anything like me, they join at the last moment. And yeah, I can see people are coming. So we're going to wait just a few moments, if that's okay with everyone, before we get going, because it'd be nice if as many people who are coming can be joined in. I'll just wait one more minute. If you can hear stray voices, I'm in a university where I teach, and students are just finishing class, and the corridor outside my office seems like a motorway. Okay, I think we'll just wait half a minute more and then we'll begin. Okay, I think we'll get going now. So welcome. My name's Anne Karp, and I'm going to be chairing this webinar, which is launching a new paper published by the Women's Budget Group today, called Revitalising Local Communities by Maeve Cohen. Really exciting paper. So delighted to be launching it with you today. This paper is part of a project being run by the Women's Budget Group together with another fabulous group, the Women's Environmental Network, and together they are developing a Feminist Green New Deal. And the point of this is that very often environmental groups leave out the gender aspect, and women's organisations leave out the environmental aspects and the climate emergency. And so these need to be brought together, and gender inequality is such an important part of the environment debate that has been neglected for far too long. And one of the things that I certainly, and I'm sure we've all observed in the discussions around the climate crisis, is that the subject seems so vast and so global that it kind of encourages a sort of gigantism, that, you know, it's a global subject, so we need global solutions. And what gets left out of that is the fact that we all live in particular places. We're very conscious of different communities of identities now, but we live in communities of place and in local areas. And the potential of local communities and localities to produce and develop solutions to the climate emergency are really exciting. And that's the subject of our discussion today, and the intersectional aspects of it. So this is how it's going to work. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker, Maeve, will talk for 10 to 15 minutes. Then Francis will talk for 10 to 15 minutes. And then it'll be open to you in the Q&A. You can follow the conversation, though, at #GreenCaringEconomy. So don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A box. And of course, feel free to introduce yourselves to each other using the chat function. So our two speakers are Maeve Cohen. Maeve is a campaigner and an organiser who is working to build inclusive economies. She's an independent consultant for the Women's Budget Group. She's the author of the report we're discussing today. And she's also the project lead at Social Guarantee, which is a very intriguing title, which I hope she will explain to us. And Maeve will be followed by Francis Jones, who is the Associate Director of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. So over to you, Maeve.
Thank you so much, Anne. Yeah, it's really lovely to be here, and thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I've not got a lot of time, so I'm just going to get straight to it. Yeah, revitalising local communities. So how do we revitalise local communities in a feminist and green way is an unbelievably big question, and it was quite tough to sort of, there's so much work on this, so much literature on this, it was quite tough to limit the scope to this one paper. So the first thing I had to do was sort of think about define what I meant by local communities. And as Anne said, what I focused on in the paper is communities of place and looking at people in the places that they are in. And obviously I recognize that there's a lot of differences and inequalities between people in specific places. But I wanted to look at places because I wanted to look at people's material conditions. And if we think about intersectionality and these different systems of oppression and how they intersect and interact with each other, often the outcome of different systems of oppression is that people aren't having their material conditions, they don't have good material conditions, and they aren't having their fundamental needs met. So I don't think that meeting everybody's fundamental needs is going to get rid of racism or homophobia or sexism, but it does go a long way towards making people's lives better. So that is what I wanted to focus on in the paper. Also, communities are made up of lots of different things. They're made up of social infrastructure and societies and the way that we interact with each other socially, but also the physical buildings and the physical infrastructure. So I've touched on both of these aspects, but I've mainly focused on the sort of physical space. The built environment is the term that people use for it, and the way that people live in their built environments. And I've also drawn quite a lot on this movement, which I've called progressive localism within the paper, but which is also called new municipalism, municipal socialism. There's lots of different names for it. And I know that Frances is going to talk about the work that Claire's does on community wealth building. So I'll leave her to talk a bit more about that. But it's all about different groups of people in different municipalities all across the world sort of rethinking what local economic development is and how they can use the resources they have to create more inclusive and fair economies and societies within the places that they live. And then lastly, the sort of core of what I'm talking about in the paper is drawn off needs theory, and this idea that the point of our economic and social systems should be making sure that people's fundamental needs are met. And these, I mean, this is work that's gone on for decades. I'm sure you've all heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is just the idea that there are certain things that everybody needs to be able to participate in society with. And in the paper, I've drawn on Ian Gough's work, and I've talked about the needs of nutrition, shelter, social participation, health, physical security, and income security. And to just go on off on a little side note and to answer Anne's question on the social guarantee. The social guarantee is an organisation that I'm working for at the minute, and the social guarantee is a sort of policy framework which is designed around meeting people's needs. And we think of it as the social pillar of a Green New Deal. So it's very much in line with these feminist Green New Deal aims. I'm sure that you're all aware of the critiques of some plans for a Green New Deal where it focuses on decarbonisation in the sense of green energy or electric cars, and does very little to focus on the social aspect and how, in order to address climate injustice, we really need to be addressing social injustice at the same time. So if you're interested in some of the stuff that I'm saying today, please check out the Social Guarantee. It's socialguarantee.org or Social Guarantee on Twitter, and sign up to our newsletter, get involved. It's great. Right, so I'm going to talk about the sort of meat of the paper, and I'm going to talk about it very briefly because, as I say, there's a lot. I mean, I've tried to condense it down into this paper. I'm sure I've missed loads out, and then I'm going to try and condense down the paper further into this talk. So I will miss loads out, but please do ask me questions at the end of it. But I'll just go in order of the areas of need that I talk about. So the first one is nutrition. And the thing that really interests me about nutrition, again, is looking at it from this sort of feminist and green angle. So there's loads of stuff out there about how we need to have more locally organic food, we need to have food sovereignty and all of that sort of stuff. But a lot of the times when we talk about getting rid of agribusiness and all of that sort of stuff, we sort of overlook the fact that a lot of the technologies and innovations that have massively reduced the burden of domestic labour and done a huge amount to enable women to not be tied to the kitchen sink all day, they're not very green. And this is particularly the case with food. So it's a lot easier to shove some potato smileys in the oven than it is to make your own chips, for example. So if we are going to move to a lot more locally grown organic food, then we're really going to need to consider how that increase in labour is distributed and ensure that that doesn't just fall on the shoulders of women. And one of the things I talk about in the paper is this organisation called Co-op Cycle. And they are a platform cooperative. So they are using platform technology, but they're doing it in a way that's inclusive. So they are a platform of a cooperative of bike delivery people across Europe. And they share this technology to be able to deliver services in a similar way as Deliveroo or Just Eat. But of course, they're all members of this cooperative, so they all have a say on the ethics and the employment standards and the rest of it of the delivery service that they provide. And I absolutely love the idea of using things like Co-op Cycle to sort of distribute some of this labour. So if you've got like local restaurants and local kitchens who are processing this locally grown organic food, and then using ideas like Co-op Cycle to deliver this food to local people to ensure that they have healthy diets, it's sustainable, but it's not just going to be hours of chopping up potatoes, basically. Next, I look at shelter. So 80% of the houses that we're going to inhabit by 2050 have already been built. So retrofitting is really, really important. Now, I live in a rented house, and as we know, the vast majority of people on low incomes, who are disproportionately women and people of colour, also live in rented houses. And there's very little I can do when it comes to retrofitting my house. Like, I can barely get my landlord to fix a leak, let alone put solar panels on the roof. So we need to move away from the system of retrofitting being the responsibility of homeowners. Retrofitting really needs to become the responsibility of the state. So we need to get rid of these like stop-start schemes like the Green Homes Fund and things like that last for a couple of years and then peter out. And the state really needs to take responsibility for retrofitting the housing stock in the UK. And this really needs to be done in collaboration with the people who are actually living in the houses and the people that are going to be using these energy saving technologies to make sure that they are actually used and they are actually providing the energy savings that they're designed to do. The next thing I talk about is social participation. And the main thing I talk about with this is 15-minute cities. And there's been a long-standing feminist critique of urban planning, which is a sort of the physical division of labour, right? You've got your central business districts where all the productive work happens, and you've got your suburbs where all the reproductive work happens. And this makes it really difficult for women to who have the most of the caring responsibilities to be able to work. And this is one of the core points of the spiral of inequality, the work that the Women's Budget Group did last year, looking at systemic gender inequality. And one of the things that they identified is that women, because they need to be close to home, because they have more caring responsibilities, are often forced into casual, insecure and low-paid work nearby. So COVID has opened a world of possibilities with this. Obviously, there's been huge disadvantages of home working, and which I don't have the time to go into. But the idea of making sure that people can live and work and have all of their needs met within a really small radius around their house, within 15 minutes walking or cycling distance from their house, is a really exciting one. And it's not only good for the gendered outcomes, but it's also good, of course, for environmental outcomes. If we're not driving everywhere, and if we're walking and cycling, also has really good health outcomes. And finally, on the sort of social participation front, if we design a system that's the center of that system is meeting people's needs, that's really good for solidarity. That's saying that we as a society are not going to let anybody fall below this specific level, right? We're not going to build a safety net that we can punch holes in and that everybody can fall through. We're going to work together to create a foundation upon which everybody can build fulfilling lives. And that's a really important aspect of this paper and of the social guarantee. And the next thing I talk about is health. And obviously there's a lot in health, and there's a lot on care, and I know that Claire's has done loads on care, and obviously the Women Budget Group have done phenomenal stuff on this. Again, I'm mainly talking about physical spaces, so the main thing I talk about is green spaces. And we know that these are good for stress reduction, for immune responses, for healthy respiratory systems, for even pregnancy outcomes, fitness levels. Green spaces and urban green spaces are super important. They're also really important for green reasons. Obviously, you've got carbon sinks, you've got trees bringing carbon out of the air, but also having porous earth, which rain can fall on, and that prevents flooding. So generally, what I've spoken about in the health section is about green spaces, but also I do say a little bit about the NHS and about the collective provision of health services is more efficient and more green than having privately owned healthcare systems. So I do talk about how we really need to reverse the privatisation of the NHS and recognise that the collective provision of services is not only good for redistributing wealth, but it's also more environmentally friendly. The next one is physical security, and again there's this whole world of things that are really relevant to physical security and violence against women and girls and domestic violence and the rest of it, and I haven't spoken about that. I've again mainly focused on, or solely focused on, the built environment. And another long-standing feminist critique of urban planning is the idea that most planners are male, and if you've got these men sitting in City Tower who are designing cities for the sort of neutral member of the public, that's often very, very gendered. So feminist urban planners try to recognise the fact that different spaces are used by in different ways by different people at different times of the day, and it's essential to sort of co-create spaces with the people who are going to use them to make sure that they're fit for purpose. And in the paper, I use an example from a collective in Spain who are doing this, but the other day I came across this video, which I probably should have been aware of before now, but of Sustrans doing this stuff in London, this project called DIY Streets. And there was this street where all the bins were out on the street, there's really fast cars, and Sustrans worked with the community in the street and with the local authority to identify what the problems were and then work together to come up with solutions. So they ended up having collective bins rather than individual bins just off the pavement, and they put barriers in so cars would slow down. And the end of it was a street that children could play on, that people felt safe on. It's just, there's a lovely video. I'll share it afterwards if people are interested. And then the last area of need is income security. And as I say, collective provision of services is really very green, but we do need to recognise that not all services can be provided collectively, and people are going to need enough money to buy the things that they individually need to buy, and that's things like clothes, it's things like food. And so in the paper, I advocate for a minimum income guarantee, and that's just making sure that absolutely everybody in society has enough money to afford the things that they need. And the vast majority of people, that will come through a living wage and in good quality work. But for those who can't work, then adequate cash benefits is really essential. And that's it on the needs. I'm just very, very quickly just going to talk about the role of the state, because while we're talking about local things here, and while the local is super, super important and an essential part of the puzzle, we need to recognise that the state has a really important role. So if you've got a really deprived area trying to use its resources to meet people's needs, it's going to have a lot worse outcomes than if you've got a really wealthy area doing the same thing. So it's really important for the state to be able to distribute funds and resources in an equitable way to make sure that that you aren't going to be disadvantaged just because of where you are in the country. It's also really important that the state is the direct provider of some services. So a national rail system, for example, it would make sense for the state to provide that rather than loads and loads of different localities. And then finally, a really important role of the state is, if we're saying that everybody has the right to access life's essentials and the right to have their needs met, that needs to be an enforceable right. So it's really important for the state to set and enforce standards. And if there's gaps in provision in some localities, say there's no childcare in a certain place, then it's up to the state to go in and either provide that service directly or to invest in that locality to ensure that they can meet that need themselves. So yeah, that is it from me. Again, look at the social guarantee. We go into all of these things in a lot more detail. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions on any of that if you have them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maeve. Brilliant timekeeping. That was a real tour de force of summarising your paper, which is very rich, and I do encourage people to read. Good. We'll go straight on to Frances.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you, Maeve. Wow, what a brilliant presentation. I can't wait to get stuck into the details of it. So yeah, I'll crack through my bit and then let's get into the discussion. As Anne said at the beginning, I'm Fran Jones. I'm one of the Associate Directors at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and we're the National Organisation for Local Economies. We were founded 35 years ago this year, and in that time we've been working with places across the UK and some further afield to build local economies that do exactly what Maeve said, what economies should do, create good lives for people and for place. And I think what's just so exciting for me about this work that you've talked about, Maeve, is that it gets to the crux of where that work, I think, is at the moment in the UK, and that is obviously the rapid decarbonisation of economies, and how do we make that transition something of an opportunity to remake those economies in so that they work for social and economic justice, and that's where all our work should be at the moment. I think there's no other game in town. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what maybe you point to in the paper as a kind of potential one tool in the box of how we might do this at a local level, and that is community wealth building, which is an approach to local economic development that Claire's has been involved with and leading on it to some extent in the UK over the last decade or so. So I'll talk a little bit about where community wealth building came from, what we see as the kind of key tactics in it, and then I'll just give a couple of examples of places that are doing this in practice that I think speak to those wider agendas around a feminist Green New Deal. So yeah, community wealth building as a term, as an idea, has been around for sort of 8-9 years, came out of work from the following the global financial crisis, of people saying, these are across the UK and the US to in many places, that since the 1970s we've had this terrible disconnect that's been apparent in advanced economies. And I have got a couple of slides. I was very impressed with Maeve's ability to present without loads of slides, so I promise I've only got a few, but this one I think might help illustrate my point. So we've had this problem since the 1970s that while GDP wealth has been growing in global terms, wages have become disconnected from that, and so incomes have stagnated, or in many cases fallen in real terms, and poverty has gone up. So we see, there's this kind of claim, isn't there? Basically what should happen in a capitalist economy, you should have growth and it should translate into improved living standards for people. And that has been not true in advanced economies, and particularly in the UK, since the 1970s. And the problems got worse and worse and worse. And I think it's important to say that there are kind of many things beneath that, but two of the really important drivers of that are an increase in property, leading to generating wealth for the few and leading to enormous inequality. Maeve's touched on it in terms of the issues around the private rent, rented housing in the UK. So the growth of property is a generator of wealth, and then also very importantly that the economy in the UK and in other advanced economies has become dominated by big global corporates whose basic model of business operations may be to operate in a place in the UK. They might have a call centre, or they might produce something, or they might have a logistics hub, but that the money that they make from that, only a small proportion of that goes into the often low-paid jobs of those the people who work in that place, and the bulk of the wealth generated from those operations does what our former Scottish chief exec would call scooches out of the place and into the pockets of shareholders, who are often many thousands of miles away from where those businesses are actually operating. And so we've seen in key sectors of the UK economy that the balance has shifted. So you can see it everywhere around you, can't you? The small businesses has not been able to survive against the competition of some of the big multinationals. And so in retail, in leisure, in hospitality, we've seen that these big multinational companies come to dominate. And what that means for people, what this sort of graph means for people, is staggering levels of inequality, staggering levels of poverty, and the growth of in-work poverty, and Maeve touched on that in her presentation, and a hollowing out of local economies. And we've seen it, haven't we? You only need to walk around large parts of the UK to see that economies are no longer sustaining thriving places. Talk about high streets, but we can talk about the kind of basic infrastructure of physical built environment of many places as well. And of course, all of that is can only be understood if we understand the intersectional nature of that inequality. And just to look at those graphs, we know that the low wages are particularly concentrated among women, people of colour, people with disabilities, and so we're facing a very an enormous challenge and a macroeconomic problem in terms of economic justice. And that is really what where community wealth building comes in, because community wealth building says, well, these are enormous challenges. So and they operate at this international level. So what can we do about it at a local response, given that the headwinds against building a more equal society are extremely strong? And so I'm just going to stop sharing. And so what community wealth building says is, there are examples of valiant efforts at a community and grassroots level to buck this trend, to grow worker-owned businesses, to try and wrest control of little bits of the high street away from extractive landlords, to try and buy small amounts of private rented stock and return them to social housing. And there are these valiant efforts, but they are facing these absolutely enormous headwinds of the way that the economy runs and operates at a national, international level. And so what can we do to kind of increase the firepower of available to change these from being valiant efforts that break through the cracks of a failing economic system, and actually start to try and reorganize whole parts of a local economy? And that's where community wealth building lands at this idea of anchor institutions, which some of you might be familiar with as a term. So these are basically big organisations rooted in place that aren't going to go anywhere. So they might be a local council, they could be a hospital. Leeds General Hospital is not about to up sticks and decide that it's better business for them to go into Plymouth. That they employ a lot of people, that they spend a lot of money on goods and services, and that they often have significant physical and financial assets. And so the theory goes with community wealth building, well, could we harness the resources of those anchor institutions to provide some of that firepower that takes the small valiant effort and helps to give that the scale which would actually start to change how places operate as places. And so that in practical terms leads us to think, well, what are the kind of ways to do that? Well, one of the ways might be to think about how those organizations spend money in their supply chains. And that could be anything. It could be, what they spend on kitting out their offices, or it could be their catering requirements. So how could that be spent in a way which supports this aspiration to move to a local economy that is rooted not in big extractive businesses operating in those places, but towards more what we call generative businesses and organizations that actually are more likely to employ locally, they're more likely to invest in the place, they're more likely to see their long-term future in a place, and perhaps be involved in things like long-term pipelines of employees coming through their organizations. So how can we think about the supply chains of those big anchor institutions? How can we think about who they recruit? Because actually these anchor institutions themselves represent large parts of wealth, and democratically, it's our money. You know, this is not the profits of shareholders in the Cayman Islands. This is our money as citizens of Britain. And how can we think about ensuring that the jobs that are available in those anchor institutions are ones that are accessible and open to people who live in the places that those organisations are based? And then, as I said earlier, also thinking about their financial power. You know, they've often got significant reserves or operating budgets, and how can those perhaps be put at the service of beginning to grow and develop some of these more generative local businesses and local organisations. And then thirdly, fourthly, thinking about their physical land and assets, and again, those are kind of crucial parts of the pie. In Newham, I was doing some work recently in Newham in London, and Newham Council owns something like 2/3 of the land of Newham. Think about the London economy; that is absolutely eye-watering, and gives them it's not completely straightforward. There's often things on that land already, but what could you do in an environment where land is the thing that drives wealth extraction beyond anything else, to put that land at the service of building a more just and generative local economy? So community wealth building says, well, let's think about using that firepower, that financial firepower, the human resourcing firepower, and reorganize local economies using that firepower. And I think we have these 4 principles of community wealth building, and underpinning them a commitment to move from local economies based on extraction to local economies based on generative models of doing business and operating. But the thing that's often missed out, and I think this is the bit where I get to the kind of crux of what makes Maeve's paper so fascinating and important, I think, is that underpinning all of this is community wealth building cannot be just about more local stuff. You can't just leave it at, well, okay, we're in Sandwell in the West Midlands, and the council used to spend X amount with big extractive multinationals, and it shifted some of that, and now it's spent some of it with small businesses in Sandwell. You know, that's a good thing. There's no doubt about it. But the real potential of community wealth building is to say that all of this stuff is done with the intention of reorganising the economy for social and economic justice. And that's the rub, I think, because in many places and many times, I think that the rebalancing gets as far as saying, well, local is better than global, probably true in lots of dimensions. But if we're starting to get into the idea of getting into economic justice and starting to deal with inequality, it needs to go a step further than that, I would say, and the best examples do. So just to sort of pick up a few examples of that. We'll talk about kind of 3 places that I think have really sort of understood this. So in New York, the City Council in New York has been taking a community wealth building approach for a number of years. They've done a lot of work on understanding where in the New York economy are the sort of the greatest dysfunctions, if you like. And so, you know, surprise, surprise, one of the areas they've hit on is home care, and the recognition that sector is grossly underpaid, that it's largely insecure, that it operates absolutely against the interests of many of the people who work in it and many of the people who receive it, and it's heavily drawn from women, people of colour. And so their response has been, well, actually this sector is very dominated, as Maeve's paper says, by extractive corporates. What if we were to focus our energies in terms of developing worker ownership in New York around those building care co-ops? And so they've said, well, how can we use our leverage as a buyer of some of that care, and some of our land and assets, and some of our financial covenant, use our financial covenant to start to incubate the kind of social care co-ops that we have seen grow up in various different places, but to do that at scale and with the full backing of the City Council and some of the other anchor institutions of New York. So I think that's been a really, you know, it's not it's an area that lots of people are involved in. I think what's interesting about it from a community wealth building point of view is it's really saying, let's put all of our resource as a big organisation behind efforts to support the conversion of businesses into worker ownership, particularly for women and people of colour. In the UK, just a couple of other examples, again, to speak to your framework, Maeve. In Mid Wales, we've seen a really interesting piece of work begin, and it's in relatively early stages still, driven by the NHS here, the local health trust, and the council, to look at food supply. And they did a piece of work with us where they registered that they were buying a lot of their food from kind of big multinationals registered in the Cayman Islands, and looked around and said, well, who else could we potentially kind of get to provide some of those services? Couldn't really find a huge number of providers in a position to provide some of those services, and so are beginning the long and slow work of engagement with the social economy players in that part of Mid Wales to say, well, what would it take to de-risk your investment in the growth of alternative models of food supply, to supply the hospital meals, the homes in meals in care homes, and to do that with an idea that public finance and demand can de-risk that investment, but that those once you've built those businesses and that supply chain, that becomes something which then moves into the commercial economy and is something that that can be put at the service of the wider population of Mid Wales. So some really interesting work going on there, a nice example, I think, of the NHS being involved in these conversations as well as local government. And then thirdly, I wanted to talk about the work in Lewes, a district council in Sussex, who have absolutely tied together decarbonisation, huge commitments around decarbonisation with community wealth building. And there, you know, Lewes is a relatively small council as UK councils go, but they have been very tactical and clear, I think, about how can they use their direct influence and their influence of other players in the area to work out what are the things that that could start to begin to set off a wider change in our economy. And so they have been focusing particularly on housing and the decarbonisation of housing, absolutely with Maeve on the huge flaws in the UK approach to retrofit and all of that. What they've chosen to do in Lewes is to start off with a massive programme of decarbonisation of council housing stock across East Sussex, and to use that as a way of developing the kind of suppliers who will be able to service some of the owner-occupiers themselves, and then begin to try and get into the thorny problem of what you do about private rented accommodation, but at least to get that started with that big injection of cash, and to make sure that this isn't something that just goes into the pockets of a few national construction firms who don't do a particularly good job on some of it anyway. They've also done some interesting work in Lewes about using loans from the council to support community solar schemes, and that again is an example of a kind of different model of ownership of the energy infrastructure of Lewes, and how they can leverage the council's finance to support that a scheme which probably would never get off the ground without that kind of support. So I'll stop in a sec. I think I just finally wanted to say that I think what's really exciting about community wealth building and the work that we're starting to see pop up around the country is that in a way this is like a guerrilla Green New Deal, because I mean we can't call it a Green New Deal, can we? Because it's because it isn't that big massive injection of public investment that we need. And let's not kid ourselves, you know, we haven't got it, have we? But what community wealth building does do is say there is large chunks of wealth out there that can be put at the service of the goals of a feminist Green New Deal. And if we set the intention right, then perhaps we can begin that guerrilla action, which will get us at least some of the way there.
Thank you so much, Frances. Wow. I am quite beside myself with excitement having heard your presentation. I thought I knew a bit about this area, and I clearly don't know anything. And this is really such encouraging examples you've given. I want to kick us off, and so I'm just going to remind people watching, participants, to use the Q&A to ask questions. There is a question in the chat that's been put in the chat, which I will come to. But I wanted to kick us off by asking a question about what is about to happen most imminently, which is COP26. And you've both referred to, I mean, you're talking about local initiatives, but you've referred to the role of the state and the national role. But when we get to COP26, we're talking globally. And how does this kind of local participation sort of, where is the connect of that and the global initiatives? How can those be sort of fed in or somehow be integrated? So perhaps I'll go to Maeve first and then come back to you, Frances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that particularly from a feminist perspective, and that critique of urban planning that I mentioned about it's all men in City Hall designing how our cities look, the same could be said about the sort of climate politics, and it's very gendered and it's very male. And I think that feminist politics and feminist planning and the rest of it is a lot more deliberative, it's a lot more horizontal, it's all about talking about the relational and the everyday and how we actually experience our lives. And you just can't do that on an international level. You can do it on a local level and bring it up to the international level. And I think that that's a really important aspect of it is the sort of direct democracy aspect of it and incorporating the needs and views of people on the ground. And another really important aspect of the importance of the local stuff is that people need to feel some agency. Like we have all felt, or all do feel completely crushed by the scale of economic transformation that needs to happen to be able to continue to exist on this planet. And what, like exactly like you said, Anne, when Frances did her talk, I get goosebumps. I get super excited just thinking, actually, people are doing something. And it's not like just recycling plastic bottles. It's like, no, people are changing the way their local economies work. And it's inspiring and it makes people believe that another way is possible. And it gives people tangible things that they can do to help create another world. And in fact, just on my personal journey, finding out about community wealth building completely changed what I was thinking and doing with my career, because it was like, right, there is stuff that we can do. And if we've got local people doing stuff and people on the ground doing stuff, that does translate into national politics and then in turn into international politics. So yeah, I think it's super important and completely necessary for the sort of international climate movement to be able to do things that are effective for everyday people. We're all everyday people, but everyday people on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you very much. But just before I turn to you, Frances, it just reminds me, I mean, I'm sure people participating will know that of the movement, #SheChangesClimate, to have more women involved in COP26, because the numbers are really shocking, not least from the British government. And it reminds me of someone, I can't remember who it was, who said, if there's one woman on a committee or in a group or in an institution, she feels a great pressure to do things the way that men do. If there's more than one, there's more of an energy to change things. And so, you know, the token woman is wrong from every aspect. But Frances, do you want to answer the question about how the link between the local and the community level to the global?
Yeah, excellent. That is such an important question, isn't it? Because I think that, you know, it sort of goes back to what I was saying about the guerrilla nature of this. And I'm sort of pulled in two directions about it, because part of me thinks, we've got to be in the billions, trillions of pounds of investment, haven't we, for a real transition around carbon. But what I see from the community wealth building movement pulls me in the other direction, which is, we've seen now close to a decade of places kind of getting this idea and starting to do things with it in their own places. And, I think we've got something like, we think about 60 or 70 councils in the UK now sort of adopting community wealth building in their own way, in their own places, up from, 4 or 5 years ago. And that, and what's really interesting as a local government person, you go in and talk to people about it, and it's like it's got this kind of maverick energy about it. It's like we can, exactly what you're saying, Maeve, like we've got agency, we can start to do something, we can do something here. And then in Scotland and in Wales, it's a really important part of the UK picture, the governments have got really interested. So like, Westminster, never been a fan of community wealth building, but Cardiff and Edinburgh have got this, both got big national programs around community wealth building, legislation on the coming down the path, all of that sort of thing. And it's really interesting in those places, because you go and talk to places in Scotland, and it is a slightly different kind of discussion, because it doesn't have that kind of energy to it. And I think my sort of most instructive thing here is talking to colleagues in Barcelona on Comú and some of the stuff that's been doing about they've been involved in terms of the feminizing politics movement, because I think that kind of very fundamental tenet that, from a feminist point of view, the closer, the more proximate you are, the easier it is to kind of bring about that idea of a shared life and a good shared life and democracy built from people actually being able to relate to each other. That when you said at the beginning, Anne, that how do we produce and develop solutions to climate emergency? I mean, my kind of core belief is that those solutions will come from that level, from people who are trying to work out how do you build something from the 15-minute radius of your house, when you can actually be in relation to each other, because it has the potential at least to be more democratic, and to hear the voice of and agency of people, everyday people, and to act as a really, really important counterweight to the international. And the other thing about that is that there is enormous appetite for those places to collaborate and learn from each other and to share. And we run a few networks around community wealth building, and I mean, honestly, it's like all you have to do is say we're going to run a session on X, and you get this like huge numbers of people who just want to come in and talk to each other about, well, how are you doing it here and how are you doing it there? And there's a sort of local energy to that, which is almost national in scale, if you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so brilliant about it is that, I mean, I was doing a talk on women in the climate crisis on Tuesday evening, and the question always comes up, what can we do? And people have had it fixed in their heads that either a feeling of complete hopelessness and it's too big to even contemplate, or recycle. And it's like there's nothing in between. And what you're talking about is precisely in that place that gives people agency, that they can get involved, but in a collective way and in a local way that isn't just about some individual token gesture. I mean, I think this is so exciting. Now, we've had a question in the chat. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. But we've had a question about, in order for women to be able to participate in the green economy, they need, the most basic fundamental thing is affordable childcare. And I just wondered if either of you or both of you wanted to react to that.
Yeah, I mean, 100% totally agree. It's purposefully not in this paper because it's such a big area, and the Women's Budget Group are specifically doing a piece on that and have done a lot of work on that. But it's, yeah, absolutely fundamental. I couldn't agree more. And I know that Claire's has done some amazing work on looking at the sort of extractive models of ownership that currently exist within our care system, and how that model fundamentally doesn't work. And I think moving towards cooperative care organisations and more inclusive forms of ownership in the caring industries is absolutely essential part of creating a Green New Deal, a feminist Green New Deal. And a paper that a colleague of mine, Sherilyn, who I think is here, hi Sherilyn, wrote a few years ago on the feminist Green New Deal. Care is absolutely front and centre in that paper. So just because it's not in this paper, I don't want you to think that is in any way being overlooked.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that well, two things. Firstly, request, because quite a lot of places that we're working with at the moment have been talking anecdotally about, during COVID, a real problem that many of the sort of smaller independent childcare organisations in their place have had to give up the ghost. I mean, it was horrendous, wasn't it, for them in at the beginning, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, and being bought out by national chains. And acceleration of loss of that kind of local ecosystem of childcare. I mean, it's many people who know much more about it than me can talk about what a nightmare it is to try and run a business in that area anyway. But I think that there is a piece of work to be done about that says, you know, it's all very well talking about how economic recovery at the moment and things are all going back to normal, thank goodness. But actually, the damage that's been done is absolutely huge on some of those parts of the sector. So somebody should do some work on that. I suppose the other thing I'd say is that there's very important thing, I think, from the feminist perspective, sort of Green New Deal work, and I think this is beginning to percolate through now, about caring work being absolutely fundamental to the green transition. And we're beginning to see a few places now adopting their community wealth building approaches, some really quite big aspirations about things like saying, you know, we would like 1 in 10 school children in next place to go to have a fulfilling career in the caring industry, and that'll be part of our decarbonisation plans, or, you know, 1 in 5 or whatever number it happens to be in place. And I think that's a really, and have that as an economic strategy is really, really fascinating, because it relies on really skewering the why is it that these jobs are well, not why, what can you do about the fact that these jobs are often extremely unappealing on many levels, and that if you can sort of begin to think about how do you build that as a kind of really thriving sector of your economy, then you will really get that double win of an improvements in terms of the lives of the people of the place, but also a kind of good, stable, secure jobs with progression for people who work in them.
Yeah, I mean,
can I also just add to that, which I probably should have started with, is the idea that care jobs are green jobs. Care jobs are really labour intensive and really relatively low carbon. So if we're wanting to build an economy that's based on people having fulfilling work and us not destroying the planet, labour intensive, low carbon jobs are going to be the bedrock of that economy. And that is what the caring industries are. So it's not just a nice thing to have us all cared for, it's an essential thing to have, but it's also a green thing to have.
Yeah, thank you for that, Maeve. I was going to draw attention to Women's Budget Group fantastic report last year on care, which includes a line I think I've repeated almost every day since: time to care. We need time to care and time away from care. Brilliant. And the amount of women's energy that is devoted for individual women making arrangements for their children, is, you know, could be devoted to other things. I mean, when my kids were small, I remember, you know, trading quarter hours with my partner. You do an extra quarter of an hour there, I'll do one there. Crazy. We've had a question asking for a list of councils, following on what you said, Francis, from involved in community wealth building. Excuse me. So perhaps you could provide us, or we could have a link to something like that. I just want to get in very quick one last question, because one of the things, I mean, there's so many things here we could pursue that are so really rich with potential and just different ways of doing things. But the one about procurement I find particularly interesting. And I remember reading that the new female mayor of Poitiers in France was going to use her public procurement powers to, you know, to green the local economy. So, I mean, can public procurement of things like local authorities and hospitals, as you're saying, Francis, in community wealth building, can this be both decarbonising, greening, and making things more gender equal all at the same time? Do you see that it has that kind of potential?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've now got real bodies of evidence around this work in practice, you know, people being able to shift their spending. I think one of the things that happens a lot is that these things are, we talked about it a lot already, but done in silos. So there's loads of brilliant work around innovation on decarbonisation through public procurement. The Norwegians really lead the way on that. Have a look at some of the stuff that Oslo City Council have done. And then there's places like Barcelona, I think, are sort of top of my list of this around gender equality in public procurement. Bringing the two together, I'm struggling to think of some really done and dusted pieces of work, but I think the one to watch is that work in Wales around food, because I think that that's got enormous potential to kind of get to bring together decarbonisation and an understanding, perhaps not as strongly intersectional as it could be, but an understanding that needs to be something which answers the questions about providing good material conditions for people. But I think, Maeve, the level of sophistication of your analysis is something that we need to bring into some of those debates. I think we've now got a huge movement of people able to put public procurement at the service of social need, and now it needs sort of ratcheting up. It got a bit lost for a few years in the world of social value and kind of bits of volunteering here and there from kind of big corporates and things like that. And I think I think we need to sort of wrestle it back in many cases to make sure that it's really delivering on that.
Right. I'm going to ask Maeve, sorry to cut in there, Frances, I'm going to ask Maeve one very brief question. Obviously, it's the biggest question of them all, which is, your paper is a fabulous wish list about envisaging a new local economy and reimagining local economies. But obviously there are barriers to that. I mean, how feasible is it? And if you could identify a single barrier that we need to focus on to overcome that might shift things, is there anything in particular you might identify? Well, it's a hard one to fling at you like that.
Well, I'm not going to answer it they're very thoroughly, but it's just for the one thing. There's millions and millions of things that we need to do to achieve this goal of a properly revitalised local communities. But I'd say the biggest one in the UK is the centralised nature of the UK, and the fact that all of this stuff happens in Westminster and there's very little devolved power. And yeah, I think that's the single biggest problem. I'm from the northeast. I live in the northeast, and my world is so detached from London, and yet London is basically in control of most things that happen here. In North of Tyne Combined Authority, which is where I live in North of Tyne, is doing community wealth building, and it's amazing and exciting, and there are things to be done, but the concentration of power and money and resources in London is incredibly detrimental to being able for local authorities to be able to achieve any of these things. So that's the biggie for me.
And I can see that, thank you, Rush. I can see that Sherilyn McGregor has added in the chat, reform the planning system. Yes, I think we'd all share that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time here. There are lots of resources being posted in the chat, lots of links, so for you to follow up, and I certainly will be. I just want to thank you both for a really exciting hour in your company. I mean, someone was asking me what I was going to be doing today, and I just kind of thought, oh, it sounds so kind of turgid. You say something about local communities. It sounds like sort of local authority speak. And I think people's hearts sink sometimes when they hear that. And in fact, what you've been describing are really extraordinary things that are happening now. They're not just a wish list for the future. They're all beginning now. And if they can be joined up more and really infused with the ideas even more that you've outlined, Maeve, then I think they're really causes for optimism. And God knows there aren't that many of them around at the moment. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Maeve and Frances, for your contributions and your presentations today. I hope that this conversation between all of us and between the participants will continue for a long time. And yeah, thank you. And goodbye, everybody. Thanks.